Welcome back to the stream, everyone. This has been quite a frequent occurrence as we take the developments, we analyze the developments that are fast and rapidly occurring in West Asia into account. They have to be covered. We have to pay attention to this massive escalation by the US and Israel. And so we have been coming on here quite frequently to do just that. Today, I have a returning guest, a very special guest. He was on here last week before Iran's October surprise. And so we're bringing him back on this week to discuss the aftermath and what we can expect from Israel, what we can expect from Iran as the escalations and tensions reach a fever pitch. But without further ado, everyone, before we get started, I wanted to make sure you knew to hit the like button as you come into the stream. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. If you're new here, make sure you hit that notifications bell. I want to welcome everyone on Rumble because Rumble is where actually I didn't connect to Rumble, so let me do that. Apologies, that may take some time to process, but without further ado, that should be happening very soon. And we can just get right to it right now by welcoming Professor Saeed Mohammad Marandi back to the program. Professor Marandi, thanks so much for joining again.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yes, and as you're speaking, I'll make sure to put your X account in the video description so people know where to find you. Of course, go to the video description to also find Patreon, Substack, and so many more options to support this channel. Be sure, of course, to follow me on Rumble as well, because you never know when censorship will strike here. There have been many channels taken down, especially channels covering topics like these. So without further ado, Professor Marandi, let us get right started. There has been a lot of talks from the US and Israeli side about how they're going to respond to Iran's October surprise, the massive missile, some are calling it an attack, but really a response, a self-defense measure after numerous aggressions on Iranian territory and their allies. Now, the big conversation, and the US is saying it is trying to stop Israel from attacking nuclear sites and even oil sites in Iran. Israel is saying they cannot make any promises. And just today, October 5th, we are hearing that Israel's response is imminent and that there is no word that they have taken the US's words to account. So, Professor Marandi, in the context of Iran's massive response to Israel on October 1st, could you talk about what you believe Israel is going to attempt to do, or what are the possibilities? And if they do it, how will Iran then respond?
First, I think we should go back a bit and remind your viewers how the conflict started. The United States and the Israeli regime, they carried out a cyber attack on Iran's nuclear program many years ago, causing damage and putting the lives of people working in the program at risk. Later on, there were a series of assassinations where they murdered a number of scientists. One was a colleague of mine at the University of Tehran who was murdered in front of his wife and family. And all of this was carried out as joint operations. In other words, Israeli intelligence is not sufficient enough in order to carry out these operations. These were joint operations with the United States and with the full support of Western governments across Europe and elsewhere, wherever they were needed. Whether they're embassies in Iran or their embassies in neighboring countries or NGOs, Western NGOs, whenever they were needed, they were used to help the Israeli regime carry out acts of terror. For example, The United States holds the leash for the MEK terror organization, the Mujahideen Khal, as they call themselves. They have bases across Europe and North America, and they have a major camp in Albania, where thousands of people are stationed. These people, during the 1980s, fought against Iran. They carried out many terror attacks in the cities, in Tehran, and they later went and joined Saddam Hussein and fought against the country as they were being supported by the West. So they were working both with Saddam Hussein and the West, because in the 1980s, Saddam Hussein was an ally of the West. The West gave him chemical weapons and all sorts of other conventional weapons to fight Iran. So this group, the MEK, the Mujahideen Khal, as they call themselves, this cult was used by the Israelis with American consent to carry out espionage, to gather intelligence for operations, and also to carry out terror attacks in the country. So we also then saw assassinations of other people, like the Deputy Minister of Defense, and also the Israelis constantly in support of ISIS and Al Qaeda during the dirty war in Syria. And I think nowadays everyone better understands what was happening in the previous decade in Syria. The dirty war in Syria was carried out by NATO and regional allies to break the link between Iran and the resistance, to break the bridge. And regional countries did a deal with the devil. Mr. Erdogan would get a piece of the cake, but Syria would be basically a broken country controlled by the West. In Syria, when ISIS and Al Qaeda were advancing in 2013, the Iranians got involved. They were not involved for the first couple of years at all, nor was Hezbollah. Only when ISIS and Al Qaeda had brought in tens of thousands of foreign fighters, many of them from Europe, only then did they get involved to prevent these terror groups from gaining the upper hand and planting their black flags over Damascus and later Baghdad. When Iranian troops were here in Syria, the Israelis would regularly bomb them in support of these terror organizations. And so Iran, throughout these years, showed strategic patience. And then, of course, we had the terror attack on the Iranian embassy, where a number of Iranians were murdered in Damascus, and the United States, France, Britain, and Germany, they all at the UN Security Council supported Israel. In other words, they supported the airstrike on the Iranian embassy. So Iran had no option but to carry out a retaliation. Now, back then, if you recall, when Iran carried out the retaliation, many in the West ridiculed Iran. But as I said back then, the Iranians carried out this attack to force the Israelis and mostly the Americans, because the heavy duty work is done by the Americans. The heavy lifting is done by the Americans when it comes to surface to air capabilities. In general, the Israelis don't really, on their own, they're nothing. It's in any area. It's the Americans really that fund it, that support it, and that stand behind them. All these bunker busters, all these bombs that they're bombing day and night, every day planes are coming in to help them slaughter women and children. So in Syria, when this happened, the Iranians retaliated, and Iran fired 300 or so drones and missiles. Most of the drones were old drones, most of the missiles were old missiles. And the reason was, not only did Iran want to force them to fire everything they had and spend billions of dollars, but more importantly, the Iranians wanted to gather intelligence to see what capabilities they had, so that next time round, if necessary, Iranian missiles and drones could be fired in a way in which they would have maximum effect. So again, when the Israeli regime murdered martyr Haniyeh in Tehran, who was a guest, and I'm sorry if I'm tiring your guest, but I think these are all important. When they murdered the martyr Ismail Haniyeh, who was the political head of Hamas, when they murdered him in Tehran, at that time he came to Tehran as a guest of the president-elect, and he was in his inauguration, and they hugged, and later on he was murdered in Tehran in an official guest house. So when the Iranians took that to the UN Security Council, again, the United States, France, Britain, and Germany supported Israel. So terrorism in Iran is allowed, bombing Iranian embassies is allowed. The Iranians decided that obviously they have to retaliate. That retaliation took some time. Some people were critical of it. I have no real comment to make on that at this stage because I really don't know what goes on behind those closed doors. Some some say they do, but I'm skeptical about some claims made by people because I think some of them probably have even less access than me. But in any case, part of the delay was because of the negotiations over the ceasefire, even though the Iranians knew that the United States was lying and that there were no plans for a ceasefire, but the calculation was, and this is something that the martyr Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah said in a speech that he made when they carried out their retaliation. He said, "We waited because of the negotiations." And what is the problem of not waiting? Because if, for example, the Americans, uh, if they, while they were supposedly negotiating, even if the Iranians carried out the attack, the Americans, the Europeans, the Israelis, and regional countries would all suddenly say that we're on the verge of an agreement. We're about to end the bloodshed. We're going to save Palestinian lives. But these Iranians did not want peace, and they proved that they want to sacrifice Palestinian women and children for their own interests. So, which of course was a lie, would have been a lie, but that's exactly what they would have done. And it would have had a huge impact, I think. So part of the delay was because of that. There are other calculations which I could get into, but it's speculation. Uh, Iran preparing itself for defense uh, in case when Iran ultimately attacks. But I'll leave it at that for now on. What I can say is that the Iranians believe that an Israeli response is almost inevitable. When they carried out the attack, that was the expectation. But regardless of the nature of the Israeli strike and how uh, large it is, and have no doubt that it will be carried out with full American support and full coordination. If the Americans say don't do this, and then the Israelis say, well, we're going to do, we may do it, that's all for show. They are cooperating at every level in their attacks on Iran. In their attacks on Lebanon, it is American intelligence and the Five Eyes that are used to find underground bunkers or bases in Damascus. It is Western embassies, Western NGOs, many Western journalists who, over the last couple of decades, have been gathering intelligence, along with the many refugees who pass through the country. Many of them could be used to gather intelligence. They've been working and collaborating together throughout these years, and over the last year in particular, and in the case of Lebanon, over the last month, we know American planes and drones fly alongside Gaza.
Um, Professor Marandi, I think we've lost your audio. If you can hear me, yeah.
Yeah.
It was muted for some reason on Zoom. It like muted automatically or something or other, but it's done now. You can continue. I think it's back.
Okay. Where did I get cut off?
You were talking about U.S., I believe, U.S. assistance to Israel in Lebanon, I believe, in what's going on there.
Yeah. So, well, in any case, I don't know how much of it was heard, but The point is that everything that is being done in Lebanon, in Gaza, is being done with the help of U.S. and European and British intelligence. And the strike that will be carried out against Iran will be in full coordination with the United States. And it's complete nonsense if the Americans go out and say we didn't want this and they did something else. The Americans and the Israelis are cooperating together at all levels and on all operations with regards to all operations.
Yeah, indeed. That is quite obvious, as you said, Professor Marandi. And I wanted to get your understanding of whether you believe that the United States and Israel are going to take what would be a catastrophic move to hit Iran's oil and potentially nuclear sites. There's actually a lot more pressure than I think people might be seeing. It's painted as a debate, but there are strong voices both in Israel, and now you have, of course, Donald Trump in the United States. You have a significant section of people who follow Trump and support Trump at the elite level calling for strikes of any kind, including on nuclear sites. What do you believe, Professor Marandi, would happen if Israel and the United States make this move, which Israel says could be coming at any time from now into the very near future? Are you unable to hear me? Oh, Professor Marandi, are you there? Wow. Okay, hold on one second. Let's try to
Yes, I
fix.
hear you now.
Oh, okay. Oh, did you get any of my question, or should I restate it?
No, I didn't. Actually, this happened with Scott Ritter last night, 3, 4 times ago. I don't know why. What is the problem? But anyway,
No
I'm not
problem.
touching it. Yes. You were saying.
No, okay. I'll re-ask the question then. So Professor Marandi, given all that you stated in terms of U.S. and Israel collaboration in this mounting and escalating aggression in the region, particularly toward Iran and Lebanon, but if we focus on what Israel is saying with regard to Iran, how it is going to strike at any moment, and that it's not taking nuclear sites off of the table, and that the strike could come at any moment. What do you believe would happen? How would Iran respond? And maybe you can give us a little bit of context into what exactly is possible here and what would transpire should this incredibly catastrophic and dangerous move and threat that Israel and powerful voices on the U.S. side are threatening. We have Donald Trump and the elites who support Donald Trump also calling for the most intense targeting of Iran, particularly at the nuclear level.
Well, first of all, the Israeli regime can't do that much damage to the nuclear program because it is, for the most part, and all the key elements of it are deep underground. And therefore, the damage, they could do damage, which would have, let's say, mostly uh, propaganda value. But in my opinion, if the Israelis do that, the Iranians would then have the opportunity to leave the NPT. And the Iranians could also change their nuclear posture, meaning they could move on, move away from just simply having a peaceful nuclear program. Because Dr. Kamal Kharazi, who is an advisor to the leader and who is also close to the current administration, and who was the former foreign minister during President Khatami for 8 years, he said twice, at least twice that I know, that if Iran feels threatened, if there's since I don't remember the exact wordings, I'll refrain from going further. All I'll say is that he spoke of the possibility of Iran changing its nuclear posture under certain circumstances. let's say if there's a nuclear threat or if there's maybe a threat to Iran's nuclear program. So an attack wouldn't have that much impact, but it could actually open a new path for the Iranian government. But there's also another scenario, and there is that possibility that the Americans, like the Israelis, would not carry out an attack on the nuclear program, and then the Americans would afterwards say, yes, the Israelis wanted to do this, and we encouraged them not to do it. We put pressure on them not to do so. So the attack was very limited, and therefore the Iranians have no excuse to retaliate. Something like that. In other words, pretend that the Israelis wanted to do this, but they listened to us, and so now the Iranians should not retaliate. Which is not if that is the plan, it's not going to work. The Iranian retaliation will be very large, and it will be much more significant than the Israeli strike. And I think it will be different from the strike we saw last week. But let's imagine that the Israelis did carry out this attack, or an attack on the Iranian, let's say, oil industry or other key infrastructure. The military, the missile program and the defense programs, they're all very well protected, because you have to keep in mind that the Iranians have always been concerned about American aggression. So Iran has, over the years, built much of its infrastructure deep underground, as we see in Lebanon, as we see in Yemen, as we see in Syria. The airstrikes that the Israelis carry out, usually what they hit are small arms ammunition depots. They cause big fires, but they're not really that important. The real capabilities are deep underground in Syria. All of these countries, because of the US Air Force and the Air Force that the West has given to the Israeli regime, protect themselves through these tunnels. So Lebanon has thousands of kilometers of tunnels. And that's why over the last few days, the Israelis have been badly beaten on the border, because Hezbollah is using its underground capabilities, moving troops around, surprising the Israelis, and killing large numbers of Israeli troops without giving many casualties. The Israelis, out of anger and despair, they go and bomb cities and slaughter women and children, but that's a different story. So if the Israelis strike, whether they carry out massive damage or create massive damage at let's say a petrochemical plant or an oil installation or a gas installation or any other a refinery or a series of refineries, that is possible. But the Iranian response will be very massive. It will be disproportionate, because Iran is adamant that deterrence is created. This is a lawless regime. It will be allowed to do whatever it wants. The West supports the Israeli regime. We've seen how Western governments will support Israel till the last Palestinian, and now to the last Lebanese. They bomb simultaneously Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon. The West Bank, the occupied West Bank, was bombed, where about 20 people were killed in a cafe. A whole family was wiped out in the West Bank. This has nothing to do with Gaza. This is a lawless regime which the West allows to do everything. It provides it with whatever it needs, do what it needs. So Iran has to create deterrence. There's no option but to create deterrence. So Iran will strike back very hard. Now, that could lead to further Israeli attacks, but we have to remember that Iranian missile and drone capabilities are huge. They are endless in a sense. Why? Because, as I said earlier, Iran prepared all these underground cities, underground missile and drone bases across the country, because they were concerned about not Israel, but an American attack against the country. And the United States is far more powerful than Israel. So all these bases were created to strike the Americans in the Persian Gulf, American assets across West Asia, in the Red Sea, wherever American assets are, the underground bases were created to strike back at the Americans in case of an attack. So the Iranians have hundreds of thousands of missiles and hundreds of thousands of drones, and they can just send wave after wave after wave to Israel. The Israelis can shoot down 1,000 drones, spending $10 billion maybe, which would cause as much damage as if the drones struck the targets. But after 1,000 drones or 1,500 drones, they will have no more ammunition to stop them. The missiles, the Iranians have not used most of their advanced missiles yet. From my understanding, Iran has not used hypersonic missiles yet either, because that was in the news and I was under the impression that they did. But the point is that Iran can do a lot of harm to the Israeli regime as it is fighting in the south and the north and in the West Bank. So it's not in an ideal situation. It does not have, except for Jordan, which is the king is an ally of Netanyahu, but ordinary Jordanians despise the regime. So if the regime is substantially weakened, that could make it far more vulnerable, especially if people are demoralized. So this is a choice for the Israeli regime to make. I personally think that Netanyahu probably understands this, and he knows that this is not a winning scenario. But I believe that Netanyahu is desperate to draw in the Americans into the war. So let us imagine that that happens. Let's say the Americans are foolish enough to enter the war in support of Israel. All American assets in Iraq would be swept away by the resistance. And the resistance in Iraq is outraged. They've mobilized the Iraqi population by murdering Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. They've awoken a force in Iraq that was asleep. And Iraq is much bigger than Lebanon, and it has a much larger population. It's united people as well in a way in which we haven't seen before. So they would be swept away in Iran. And in the Persian Gulf region, American bases would be seen as hostile. They would be targeted. That's what all those underground bases that Iran has are for. But more importantly, those regimes that host American bases, they will be seen as hostile, and they will be targeted too. They cannot pretend that they're neutral. They can say we're neutral and we have nothing to do with this. No, they have American bases hosted there. Those bases are used by the Americans against Iran, whether they admit it or not. When the Iranians carried out both attacks on Israel, American radar installations in the Persian Gulf region and in Turkey were used to help the American Navy and Air Force, as well as the Israelis, to bring down drones and some missiles. So if this happens, then those oil and gas installations would be destroyed. Tankers, everything would be destroyed. And that would lead to a global economic collapse. And that would change the lives of everyone everywhere. And millions of people would be on the move. And if someone says, well, the United States is too powerful, the United States couldn't defeat Ansar Allah in the Red Sea. So how are they going to defeat the combined forces of the resistance in Iran in particular in the Persian Gulf? Anyone who looks at the Persian Gulf will see that Iran has access to everywhere in the Persian Gulf. All of the oil and gas installations and the bases, the Western bases, they're all very close to Iran's border. So that would be a worst case scenario. That would be catastrophic. And hopefully we will not see such a thing, because it would lead to an economic depression that is, I think, would be far worse than what we saw in 1929.
Yes, Professor Marandi, and Iran is indeed promising that such an outcome would occur, because not only does it have the capabilities to help precipitate this should it need to do so in self-defense, but also it's just an inherent quality of what would happen if Israel were to strike in this way. But I'm wondering, Professor Marandi, If you
But this
could,
last scenario that I explained was linked to an American involvement. If it's between Israel and Iran, as I said, the Iranian response will be far stronger than any Israeli strike. But if the Americans respond or get involved, then I think we will have a war that will have consequences like no other.
yes, indeed. I'm curious about what you've made of reports if you've seen them. The Western mainstream media is very confused right now about how to assess Iran's capabilities, in particular after Iran's October missile salvo. On the one hand, you have the Washington Post admitting that targets were hit, military targets were hit by Iran, but what they claim is that Iran has exhausted its capabilities in the sense that it has essentially revealed all that it can do. The Guardian, on the other hand, has said not only has Iran not revealed all that it can do, but the fact that it was able to hit Israel without showing its full capabilities demonstrate that Iran could have the ability to do what it did on October 1st for many months at a time should the US and Israel escalate. Professor Marandi, do you have any comments or reactions to this seeming
Oh,
confusion
absolutely.
by the West?
Absolutely. The Washington Post is talking nonsense. And I think they try to convince themselves about the situation being in their favor. And we saw that in Ukraine as well. So the Israelis right now, they were supposed to enter Lebanon. They hit a brick wall and they've had high casualties. And Hezbollah has had almost, I think, 4 casualties from what I've been told by people inside Lebanon. 4 casualties in the battles. That's uh, far less than what the Israelis have had. So, but the Americans thought this would be very easy, or at least that's what Western analysts and the Western media was saying. Their optimism is based upon wishful thinking when it comes to Hezbollah. They said that they're going to just knock out Ansarullah in Yemen. Well, they still can't use the Red Sea. They thought the same about Gaza, that it would be over soon. All they did was massacre women and children, but they were never able to defeat the resistance, whether Hamas or Islamic Jihad, even though Gaza is a dot on the map. So I think they overestimate their capabilities, especially at a time when they're putting so many resources into Ukraine and spending hundreds of billions of dollars in Ukraine as well. So Iran can easily devastate Israel. There's no doubt about that. But Iran could do far more than that. Iran could destroy everything in the Persian Gulf region. So if the Americans want to take that risk or that option, then that's where we will go. Because Iran, there's no other option for Iran. If Iran does not establish deterrence, attacks will be repeated. If the Americans get involved, Iran has to hammer the Americans and those people that host America. Otherwise, the Americans will attack Iran again and again and again. So we've reached a point, and I think yesterday's Friday prayers was a very, very powerful message. There was lots of online chatter about Israelis attacking Iran and the Friday prayers. I'm sure you saw it. And people in Iran were being told that to stay away. It was they were in the millions. I had never seen such a thing like that before. So everyone came and they were prepared to be attacked. And the leader spent a lot of extra time there, more than usual. There was a ceremony before the prayers for the martyr Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, and then they began the prayers. He sat in that session too, in the same place, and then the Friday prayers. That was a strong message. So if the Israeli regime attacks Iran, uh, that is what they're confronting a people who are prepared for war. The Iranians just, there's outrage in Iran at what the Israelis have been doing in Gaza. And Iran is like no other country that I know of. It is willing to defend the Gazans. It is willing to defend the Lebanese. It is willing to make the necessary sacrifices to put the Israeli regime in a box.
Yeah, and I think October 1st demonstrated that not only is it willing to do this, but it has the capabilities to do so far greater than perhaps any other force in the resistance, albeit we have to give Yemen a lot of credit for taking the
Absolutely.
means that it did. But in terms of just outright military prowess, it goes to show that there is this capability that a lot of people, I believe, Professor Marandi, were doubting, and we still have some doubts from folks at, for example, naval institutes in the United States, which is who the Washington Post was interviewing. But at the same time, Professor Marandi, there is this, I think, actual fear coming from the U.S., those who actually make political decisions and military decisions in the United States. They are, it seems, very frightened by what could happen if Iran is forced to defend itself to an even greater degree. And now we've talked about the confusion on the part of the collective West, the Western mainstream media, on Iran's capabilities. What is the confusion about Israel's capabilities? Because I've been seeing a lot of talk about almost these F-35s being invincible, and that Israel could very well, easily and very easily conduct aerial strikes against Iran when it decides to do so. How accurate is this? And even if they do achieve some modicum of a response, what do you believe is the final end game here, given the fact that, as you said, Israel is the one looking far and far more weaker than it had prior to this past year, where we've seen, we're about a year into this genocide, we've seen Israel kill a lot of people, but at the same time, not meet many of its stated goals. And I want to emphasize stated, because they may not actually be the goals, but they are stated and we should take them seriously still. But Professor Marandi, your take.
Well, before I respond, I should point out that there's also one other country which I did allude to briefly, and that is Iraq. Iraq today is not the Iraq of 5 years ago. And the resistance in Iraq, if push comes to shove, it will have a huge role in defeating the United States. And the US and Western interests, as they call them, in Iraq will be swept away. And there's nothing that they can do. There's nothing they can do. The West is very vulnerable in this region. They will lose everything very quickly, especially with the situation in Ukraine, the horrible economic situation in Europe, and the problems and divisions that the United States has, and the internal problems, the economic problems. They're not in a position to take this region. But I think we have to go back to the first Iranian response. The first, if you again, if as you recall, when the Iranians carried out that strike, which I explained earlier, what the intentions were, what did the West do? They ridiculed Iran. Instead of taking this seriously and seeing this as an opportunity to end the escalation, Western media, Western pundits all said this was a big win for the Israeli regime. And they tried to humiliate Iran, and they created an environment for further escalation, and which we saw with the murder of the martyr Haniyeh. So now, if the West wants to continue to pretend that Iran does not have those capabilities, then I think they are leading their own families down the road to misery. Because if the global economy crashes, then their livelihood will be dramatically changed as well. Everyone's lives will be changed. Iran has sort of established a balance of terror with the United States. Just like during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States had established a balance of terror, the Iranians and the United States have now, the Iranians have established a sort of balance of terror with the United States, because the Iranians can strike back at the Americans in a way which will bring down the American economy. Uh, no one wants that. As I said, no one in Iran, no one in the region, no one in the resistance wants escalation. But the West is hell bent on escalation. They support the Israelis every step of the way. When they bombed the embassy, they supported it, and so on. So the West wants escalation. On the one hand they're fearful, but on the other hand they're pushing for more escalation. So it is a very, very dangerous situation right now. But Iran is determined to to make sure that deterrence is established. And Iran's missile capabilities are enormous. Its drone capabilities are enormous. And I think if people in the West fail to appreciate that, then they are helping to create a situation where uh, it would end very badly for everyone. Again, it goes back to I remember many years ago, I was on Al Jazeera. The Iranians had because of their standoff with the West, they decided to enrich uranium at 20%. Right? This was many years ago. This was uh, before the 60% and all that we saw in recent years. I was on Al Jazeera, an expert, a nuclear expert, and I am no expert on nuclear issues. An American nuclear expert came on and said it is impossible for you because Iran had just announced that they're going to enrich uranium at 20%, like hours earlier. So Al Jazeera invited me, Al Jazeera English. This was probably a decade ago, many years ago, maybe even more than a decade, and probably more. And he said this is impossible. The Iranians don't have the capability. It would take many months, if not years, for them to do this. And I said the Iranians will do it imminently because when the Iranians say they're going to do something, they do it. Literally hours later or after the show, I don't recall exactly, but like 2, 3 hours later, the Iranians had enriched uranium at 20%. So this constant underestimation in the West, which I think is largely linked to Orientalism and a sense of superiority. And remember how Iranian missiles were all they were no good, and the Iranians were exaggerating their capabilities and all that. That's how the West likes to believe the situation is, which is fine for propaganda purposes. But if they believe their own propaganda, then it becomes very dangerous.
Yes, yes, indeed, Professor Marandi. Now, I would like to talk to you about something that isn't getting much discussion from independent media, but I think is very important to what is ongoing right now in the region between Iran, Israel, and the United States, and of course, the greater global development trend that we are seeing. And that is a lot of rumors have been circulated, a lot of unverified reports have circulated regarding Iran and Russia's relationship. Now, this reached kind of a peak moment when Israel, as it does, strikes, and very frequently, every other day, if not every day, struck Syria. And as it struck Syria, it was very close to hitting a Russian air base and actually hit a depot that both Syrians and Russians use because Syria and Russia have deep military cooperation. Now, Professor Marandi, there's been a lot of reports about Russia-Iran cooperation of late, over the last month or so, but even in just the last few days, talks about Russia giving Iran S-400 capabilities, boosting its air defenses, as well as also tipping off Iran about a possible U.S.-Israeli response. What do you make of these reports? Because all of them are coming from Israeli media themselves. Do we see these reports as simply fake news or a reflection possibly of a very real development that may be causing consternation on the side of US and Israel?
I wouldn't know um, top secret information, obviously. If I did, I wouldn't be able to say it anyway, but I don't have that sort of information. What I can say is that the Russians have always been very, they were, for a long time, they were very scared of the Americans. And the Iranian Russian cooperation was always limited. Even when Iran purchased weapons or radar or uh, air defense capabilities, the Russians would not hand it over, or the deal would fall through because the Russians were relatively weaker, and back then, and the Americans relatively stronger. The same is true with China, or was true with China. After Ukraine, the relationship evolved dramatically, and the Iranians and the Russians began cooperating much more extensively than before in almost all fields. And Iran has technology that's useful to the Russians. The Russians have technology that's useful for the Iranians. So that has changed. But how Iran has created its own air defense capabilities. It has its own radar systems because, as I said, back until Ukraine, the Russians weren't cooperating nearly as much as the Iranians would have wanted. But after that, things changed. So during the years, Iran not only did it develop its own drone and missile capabilities, it developed its own naval warships, its own radar systems, its own surface-to-air missiles. It's developing fighter jets. It's moving forward. It's not necessarily where it wants to be, but it is probably one of the most military advanced countries in the world today as a result of those sanctions. But Russian cooperation with Iran after Ukraine has changed dramatically at all levels: economic, political, and military relations. What has Iran perhaps purchased from Russia over the last few months? I don't know. What capabilities do the Russians have that would be useful for Iran under these circumstances? Again, I'm not quite sure because I'm not. I fought in a war many years ago, but I haven't. I'm not like Scott Ritter or some other people who have been in the military for a very long time and would know more about these things. So I would put that question to people like him, but I don't have that sort of insider knowledge. But what I can say is that for Iran, the best defense is offense. The assumption is that whatever Iran has, or has made itself or has purchased from other countries like the Russians or the Chinese or whoever else, at the end of the day, if Iran is attacked, uh, there will be destruction. And so the best way to create deterrence is for Iran to have a very powerful offensive capability. And that Iran does have. And if the Americans, if the Washington Post wants to make its readers feel good about American strength and about Israeli strength and how this genocidal regime is strong thanks to the Americans, they can do that. But they should then think about the day after when Iran has responded and massive devastation has been created in Tel Aviv and elsewhere. And Israel is very vulnerable. The Iranians can knock out its electricity, can knock out its port, it can knock out its energy capabilities, its energy storage centers. Israel is a small regime, and remember, it's half of the population that it's of Israel are Palestinian. They're like prisoners, but if the regime weakens, if there's chaos, then subjugating the Palestinians becomes all the more difficult. And waging war in Gaza against women and children and in Lebanon against Hezbollah becomes all the more difficult. So the Israelis are making a very, very grave mistake. But as I said, I think that Netanyahu, it could be in their arrogance. I think that the Iranians won't dare to strike back, which I think is uh, is foolish. But I think probably Netanyahu knows that Iran will strike back and strike back hard, but he is calculating that he can bring in the Americans, and that would lead to consequences that we don't even want to think about, because from New York to San Francisco, from South Africa to Japan, that would bring about complete change. And then you would have poverty like never before, and tens of millions of people would be on the move, if not many tens of millions of people. And they would probably mostly be going to Europe and the United States, because these are the traditional routes, even though things will be collapsing there as well. Right now, I've been told, and I've read, that Syrians in Lebanon are leaving Lebanon and going back to Syria and moving from Syria to Turkey. So when the West helps the Israeli regime carry out genocidal attacks, they have consequences, like the dirty war in Syria. The refugees from Syria was their undoing. They and regional countries carried out the dirty war, and then millions of Syrian refugees went to Turkey and to Europe, and they still have huge problems there. So I don't want to, I don't want to create fear. I don't want to be tough or anything like that. I said this on Al Jazeera yesterday on their show Inside Story. I don't want to be tough. I want to say how things really are. If you recall, I've been saying for quite a long time that Iran will retaliate, and it will retaliate in a very significant way. And people were ridiculing me and saying Iran is not going to retaliate. This is all talk. Well, we saw that it was not empty talk. That was the tip of the iceberg. So Iran-Russian relations have evolved dramatically over the last 2.5 years. I think a bit more than about 2.5 years now. But as I said, Iran's most important weapon is its offensive weapons, its missile and drone capabilities that can be used immediately to strike the Israeli regime.
Yeah, and when I see these reports, Professor Marandi, about Russia and Iran, for example, there is something that's often not stated, which is Iran, Hezbollah, the resistance in and of itself. They often say that they have the capacity to fight their own battles.
Oh,
And,
absolutely.
and when it comes to, though, these reports, what I see, and I'm curious about your thoughts, is you mentioned something earlier about Israel making a grave mistake. And I think one of its biggest mistakes has been completely and totally isolating itself on the world stage to the point where only the United States is really behind them. And I think that the fear, because even in Jerusalem Post recently, an old meeting, this is just reported after Iran's attack, an old meeting between the top advisor to the supreme leader of Iran and Russia's foreign ministry, a meeting that happened weeks ago was being used as a reason to say that Russia-Iran ties are a security concern. And for me, how I read that is that Israel, and I believe the United States too, are actually very worried about the fact that it isn't Iran that's becoming more and more isolated. It's Israel that's becoming more isolated, and that only spells more problems for this broader regional conflict that it is spurring in the wake of now a 1 year of genocide in Gaza. What are your thoughts about this?
That's absolutely true, and it's not just countries like Russia or China and others that are increasingly being vocal in condemning Israel. The Chinese have asked their citizens to leave. The Russians have asked their citizens to leave, from what I recall. And these are major statements. Uh, they are symbolic. And of course, as you rightly pointed out, Iran is more than capable of defending itself. We've seen how in Syria, as you alluded to, the Russians really haven't been, even though they've been given bases and assets in Syria, but they haven't been really protecting Syria as much as some expect. But so I don't think Iran is ever going to depend on Russia or count on Russia to do anything for it. But Israel is isolated, and the rise of BRICS, we all discuss these sort of things nowadays. The rise of BRICS is isolating the West, and Israel is a part of that, uh, the West. And while you're right that the Americans are fully behind, the only country that fully support the Israelis militarily and otherwise, but the whole West is behind them. No one will sanction them. No one will punish them. All of them will gather intelligence. All of them will uh, support them financially. They'll give them political cover. They'll give them, as I said, intelligence. They will give them weapons when the Israelis need it, especially the Germans. They have more capabilities than the others. So Canada, the EU, um, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, the Five Eyes, all of them are complicit in the genocide and the Holocaust in Gaza. All of them are very much on board, but Israel is being isolated across the world, across the global South, and even among public opinion in the West. But what is also important, and this is something that I think many don't calculate, is that and the rage in the region, the anger in the region is reaching a boiling point. And people are looking and seeing that Hezbollah is fighting Israel, Hamas and Islamic Jihad are fighting, Iran is fighting, but their governments, the government of Turkey, continues to have diplomatic relations. Uh, Oil from the Republic of Azerbaijan goes right through Turkey, cheap oil, this uh, going to Israel. Jordan, you have Jordan, you have all these countries that are working with Israel, and the discontent is enormous. So if it, we could reach a stage where some of these regimes become unstable, and I think that they are very vulnerable to instability. And if one becomes unstable, then many of them can become unstable. So the Americans are risking a lot right now. They're isolating themselves. They've wrecked their image across the world, the West, the collective West, because the world sees all this Holocaust as an American Holocaust, a European Holocaust, a Canadian Holocaust, a British genocide, the, um, a New Zealand genocide, also because Australian genocide, all of them are part of this. None of them can hide the fact that they are deeply involved in the crimes that the Israelis are carrying out on a daily basis, and the rest of the world sees this. So their image has been shattered. Their economy is in big trouble. The war in Ukraine, of course, continues. This is not a situation that the Americans can handle. This is not the 1990s. The United States of the 1990s no longer exists. This is a completely different world. But the mentality of the elites in the West, in Western capitals in the United States, in these prestigious newspapers and so on, is still that we are number one. This is the United States of 30 years ago. They've carried out so many endless wars. They've depleted their capabilities so extensively while countries across the world have been on the rise that they simply cannot continue this way.
Yes, the American exceptionalism still very much runs on high. And then, lastly, on this note, Professor Marandi, the fact of the matter is, it seems, is that Israel and the United States, of course, very close behind it. And I think it was a great point that you made that the entire collective West is indeed doing much to ensure Israel's so-called protection. But what's so interesting is that Israel seems not to care at all about what you would think are matters that it would care about. Now, it's quite clear, and anyone who watches this program or listens to you, that Israel does not care about people, civilians. It doesn't care about Palestinians. It doesn't care about the region, people in the region. It doesn't care because it, in fact, is a regime that enjoys this kind of massive campaign of destruction and genocide. And it has every interest in its mind to carry this out. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, these other concerns, for example, economically, even just the inherent need for stability as a colony, it seems to be throwing all of that out the window. There is no engagement in anything that could be called diplomacy. There is no engagement in anything that could be called attempting to reap stability in the wake of what is just an out of control situation for itself. Why do you think at this stage, at this moment, Israel has decided that, or maybe Israel has not decided, just can't control the fact that it has essentially given up all of these other concerns?
A lot of the decisions that are made in the world that we live in are not necessarily based on reason and logic. They're based on emotions and anger, outrage, and other emotions. And I think that the Israeli regime, their people, their decision makers, they are very much influenced by that. They consider themselves to be a superior people. The very fact that they call Palestinians, God, Amalek, the prime minister called them that. The very fact that the president of the regime said that Gaza, there are no innocents in Gaza, or the minister of defense or the minister of genocide said they were going to cut off electricity and food and water and medicine to everyone, kids, infants. We're going to, strangle them all. That shows that that shows their worldview. That shows exactly who they are. The fact that the West supported them in doing all this and hid these statements and tried to defend them when the ICJ, you read the ICJ complaint. Uh, BBC did not broadcast the South African complaint, but the next day they showed the Israeli defense. It's clear where the West stands in all this, but but I think that this behavior in the West and Israel and its supporters is what is going to ultimately bring about its downfall. Because when Palestinians are Amalek, that means Jordanians are Amalek. That means the Lebanese are Amalek. That means Iranians are Amalek. That means everyone is Amalek. And that means that no one can ever seriously engage with Israelis because they are speaking from an ethno-supremacist position, even though they're not really a single ethnicity, and they're less Semites than the Palestinians on average, but still they call themselves an ethnic state, and it's an ethno-supremacist state. So Israel is behaving irrationally, and this is not new. This is exactly what the Americans did after 9/11. The Americans, they invaded Afghanistan, then Iraq, then you had Libya, then you had Yemen. They supported the Saudis. The Americans, they lost on all accounts. And in Syria, they engaged in a dirty war. They keep saying Assad killed hundreds of thousands of his own people. No, they killed hundreds of thousands. That NATO countries and regional countries together, they bear more responsibility than this, far more responsibility than the Syrian government because they were violating Syrian sovereignty. But in any case, the point is that the United States was not making reasonable decisions. If the United States was uh, analyzing the situation rationally, there would never have been a war on Iraq. And by the way, Netanyahu, we always have to remember, Israel doesn't care about the United States. Israel doesn't care about the West. Israel only cares about itself. Netanyahu, you recall, said 9/11 was good for Israel. He also, Netanyahu, was a strong advocate of the Iraq War. Did the Israelis help the Americans in the Iraq War? Did they make any sacrifices for the Americans anywhere? Did they send troops anywhere? Did they fight alongside the Americans in Afghanistan? Or no, it's the Americans paid the price. The Israelis, from their own perspective, reaped the benefits, and the Americans paid the price. Even the electronic devices, right, that they used, they weaponized. Who do you think is sacrificed here? It's Western businesses, Western products. I, for one, am not going to buy anything, any electronic uh, goods produced by Korea, Japan, Taiwan, or any Western country anymore because I don't feel safe. I'll be purchasing Chinese goods, at least for the years to come. And I would advise others to do the same because they've allowed their products to be weaponized by the Israelis. Do the Israelis care about brand America? Do they care about brand EU? No, they only care about Israel. And these people are willing to sacrifice their own people, their own brands, their own jobs, their everything, their own credibility for Israel. So Israel is a very selfish regime, but it does not make decisions based upon rationality. The murder of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, they thought was a big win. But I was in Lebanon, as you know. I came back 2 days ago. I was there from before Sayyid Hassan was martyred. I was pretty close to where he was when he was martyred, about 1,000 meters away. I went after the shock and awe, where they killed 500 people in the south and the central Lebanon on the first day. I went there. I took a bit of aid, but I also went to see if I can help with media because I thought it would be they'd have difficulty at that time. So the Israelis thought that they scored a big win, but they only made Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah much more popular. And in Iraq and elsewhere, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, he's become much more iconic than before. And Iraq, as I said, Iraq is a very important country. The resistance in Iraq can do very bad damage, huge damage to U.S. interests. So the Israeli regime thinks, it thinks if it kills this person, that's a win. It's not necessarily a win. The people around it, he becomes bigger, and people become more dedicated to pursue his policies, his agenda. The crowds that we saw in Tehran, there were millions of people in Tehran. I was kilometers away from where the prayer was held. Do you think that crowd would have been there if Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah wasn't martyred, if Ismail Haniyeh wasn't martyred, if the Iranian general wasn't martyred? No, the Israelis are building up this rage, and that rage is partially, and that anger is partially what is going to allow the Iranians to hit the Israelis very hard because they have the full support of the population.
Yes, indeed. And perhaps we can close, Professor Marandi, on the final topic I wanted to speak to you today about, and on a positive note too. But of course, it comes with the contradiction of Israel's massive bombing campaign that it is engaging with in Lebanon. But on the Lebanon front for Israel, it has been a very difficult period in the month of October. Each and every time Israeli forces attempt to cross the border of what, out of what the Lebanese resistance calls occupied Palestinian Northern Territory. Each and every time Israeli forces do this, they are repelled, they are ambushed, and they are driven back. Now, Professor Marandi, could you put this development, this ground invasion, this was right before the October missile salvo fired by Iran. Right before this, Israel declared with all of its arrogance that it was going to invade southern Lebanon. It was going to take part in minimal operations, but that it was going to seize the moment of Nasrallah. Could you talk about, you were just in Beirut, what were people making of this particular development? as the bombs are falling on civilians, and the fact that we were told before Iran's attack that the resistance was essentially defeated. And now it seems like not only do you have Hezbollah beating back the invaders, you also have them striking into Israel itself, firing rockets into Israel, and you have Ansar Allah doing the same thing. It doesn't seem like there is much of a defeat going on here, but what have you been making of this development?
Well, in Lebanon, the Israeli success is like in Gaza. They slaughter people. And I went on a tour 3 days ago. Uh, yes, 3 days ago, with a number of journalists in southern Beirut, and I lived near southern Beirut during my sabbatical, because I was on sabbatical in 2011 and 12 in Beirut, and after that I regularly travel. Before that, I traveled as well, so I know southern Beirut somewhat well. And the devastation is extraordinary. They've been bringing just 2 3 days ago. It's online. It's if people want to watch it. I tweeted it both the YouTube version and the one published on X. Uh, we went to a place where there were just like Sayyid Hassan when he was murdered, when he was assassinated. They leveled. It was 1,000, as I said, it was 1,000 meters away from where I was. If you go directly, and they leveled three towers full of apartment towers, full of women and children. Yeah, I walked by there, I've driven by there many times. They slaughtered all these people, and the Western media doesn't focus on that aspect. They say they hit Nasser, it was a Hezbollah stronghold. This is just an ordinary neighborhood. It's an ordinary place. And so 3 days ago, when we were going around southern Beirut, and they just bombed some areas. The smoke was, rising in these places. They struck a school. They struck uh, a number of different towers. In one place, they brought down 5 towers, just like when they murdered Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. Here, they also brought down 5 towers, but you couldn't tell because it was just flat. God knows. And when I was there, I was wondering because smoke was rising. I was wondering if there are kids under there that are screaming for help. I couldn't hear anything, but I was just thinking about it. It bothered me for days. I was walking there, and maybe there were people alive under me, but there was no hope for rescuing them because 5 apartment towers were brought down, and that was just one. And then it got worse. I mean, when I was coming back to Iran, it was the day before yesterday, early in the morning. They were bombing central Beirut, and then when I was on my way to Syria, they were bombing Syria too. So these it's they have, and the West calls these Hezbollah strongholds, Hezbollah targets. They focus on and a lot they focus on making this look like these are military targets, whereas all of these are just apartment blocks full of people, like where you live, like where your audience lives, the cities that they live in, like in New York or like in Tehran or like in Baghdad or like in Shanghai or like in, wherever, Rome. But they dehumanize them in order to justify the Israeli regime. They dehumanize them to justify the massacres, very similar to what they did on October the 7th. The lies that they made about rape and beheadings was to create popular support for the Israelis so that they can carry out the genocide. That's what it was about. They were, repeating it for months, even as Palestinians were being slaughtered on a daily basis. They kept saying October the 7th, October the 7th. Why? So that people would not focus on what's happening. And this is what they were doing in Beirut as well. So Western media, they are more or less foot soldiers of this genocide. But one interesting thing did happen, and I won't mention any names. But during our tour of southern Beirut, one of the journalists came up to me from a well-known media outlet, and that person said to me, I'm not saying this about myself. I'm just an ordinary person. I my influence is very little, and I've done nothing really important. But he was praising me and saying, I listen to your stuff, I watch your stuff, you're great. I'm not like the rest of them. And you've probably seen this person at times on television somewhere. I don't want to go any further because he didn't or she didn't hide his or her identity, but I just want to make sure I don't do anything that that person doesn't want. She or he was saying that this is outrageous. So, but in general, the Western media and those who work for it, they are agents of empire. They are uh, guilty of all of these war crimes and these crimes against humanity through the means. I was invited last last night on Radio 5, BBC. It was very suspicious, my invitation. And so I went on, and the host, the presenter, was really nasty and really biased and really outrageous. And then halfway through, I said, "Why are you doing this? Is this because of a previous interview that I did, and you're under pressure?" And he said, three prominent Jewish, and of course Zionists, but he said Jewish members of the three prominent members of the Jewish community complained. And I said, that's what this is all about. So you're hammering me and you're hammering the Palestinian people, and you're blaming Palestinians, the victims, because three prominent, of course, you and I know that, thank God, so many young Jews today are standing up against this criminal regime. But these are Zionists, not Jews. But the point is that the BBC, based upon the demands made by these Zionists, comes and tries to, you know, uh, hurt me or attack me, blame the Palestinians, blame the victims. That's the world that we live in. And although things seem dark at times, but my advice to your viewers is that we all have to be active, and we have a lot of work to do, and we don't have time to be depressed or sad or feel bad about things. We have to work, whether I personally am encouraging everyone not to buy Western goods anymore, even people in the West, to buy goods from the global South, put pressure on these corporations, to be active online, to be active on the streets, to create as much awakening. We all do what we have to do. In my case, I may have more access to media, so I may have a greater impact. Someone may have only enough impact to influence his brother-in-law. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter who has more influence. But what matters is our intentions. That is just as valuable as what you and I do. If that person who has very little capability to spread the message, to wake people up, to have an impact, even if he has very or she has very little impact and influence, the important point is that they're active. If you're active, it doesn't matter how much success you have. What is important is that you do the right thing. So someone may change the views of 1,000 people, someone may change the views of a single person, someone may not even be able to change the views of anyone, but he can refrain from purchasing something, or you know uh, protest about something, protest somewhere. That's just as valuable. Doesn't matter who is has more, who has more capability and who has less capability. What's important is intentions.
Hmm. Yes, Professor Marandi, and I think it would be good now to, given what you just said about intentions and the need to really stand firm at this moment, especially for those of us in the U.S. and the collective West. Talk about the example of Hezbollah, because you were just in Lebanon and what they've done since, especially since the martyrdom of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. Hezbollah is considered a so-called terror group by much of the collective West, despite the fact that it is not just a party, it is not just a group that conducts armed resistance, but it's also a political organ entity. But could you talk about, given all that's transpired, the bombings of Lebanon, and of course, this fierce resistance that Hezbollah continues to wage, talk about their example right now and what they're doing and how they exactly are doing this in the face of what the Western mainstream media is telling us are incredible odds. They're telling us for so long that they have been degraded and defeated, but we are not seeing such a thing actually on the ground.
Well, just one thing, you may lose me soon because I'm using my cell phone and my battery is running out. But Hezbollah has been very courageous, and their morale is very high, and they feel that they have a sense of mission. They have a responsibility. They love Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, but this is again I think another Orientalist thing, that to imagine that somehow everything depends on individuals and individual charisma or individual qualities and characteristics. He was a towering man, a great man. I wept at his death multiple times. But these are people who are strong, they're highly dedicated, they're highly educated, they have a very sophisticated network of capabilities. And right now they are fighting very effectively against the Israeli regime. And ordinary people, while they were many in the first couple of days, they were dazed. But when Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was martyred, they were weeping for him rather than for their lost homes or relatives, but they were steadfast. What I saw in Lebanon was a people who were determined to defeat the Israeli regime, and I have no doubt that the Israeli regime will lose this war. And ultimately, I have no doubt that apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and this ethno-supremacist regime will not last, and that Jews, Christians, and Muslims will be living in the years ahead in the land where which is signed today, which where all people have equal rights.
Uh, well, Professor Marandi, it seems like your phone got turned around. You might have actually been cut off because of the battery. Please do rejoin if you can hear me still once you're able to charge it. If you're unable to do that, just send me a message because we're about to close up here in any respect. But with all that said, everyone, that was Professor Saeed Mohammad Marandi, who just gave, I believe, an incredible analysis of developments. And I just want to give a few announcements before I go here if Professor Marandi isn't able to come and say goodbye just yet. I want to direct you all first to Rumble, okay? Because at any point, this could be it for my channel. So you will want to go to Rumble. That is in the video description and now in the chat. Follow me there. If you're not following me there, you don't have to watch it primarily just yet, but you need to follow me there because if something happens, that's where you'll get primarily and first the information that you need to um, to understand what is going on because a lot of people are getting taken down. I can go on and on African Stream, Glenn Deason. I can go on and on about the folks that are being DD geopolitics. A lot of people who are doing this kind of work. We know Richard Medhurst was demonetized. You want to make sure that you are following me on Rumble, not because you need to watch there primarily just yet, but you may have to in the near to distant future, knocking on wood, in my head right now. But with all that said, I also want to point you to the video description in general because you need to follow me in places like Telegram, Substack, a lot of X. I have all of that in the video description. You need to follow me there too because those are also accounts where I post content and where I will continue my journalistic work no matter what. Lastly, because YouTube is such an important part of being able to make a livelihood as a creator, okay, as someone who's a journalist, primarily an independent journalist, you want to make sure that you are subscribing on Patreon as a paid member or on Substack as a paid member. You can also do so on Buy Me a Coffee. You could do one-time memberships. For those of you who are doing YouTube memberships, I appreciate all of you, but just know that if something were to happen to this channel, so too goes your membership. So that means, Patreon, Substack, these places are just better ways to support me as an independent journalist directly in case anything are to happen. I'm going to have to say this every single stream indefinitely, because at any time, especially in the next month with this election, at any time, this could be it for the channel. So I just want to make that very, very clear. Looks like Professor Marandi is back, actually. So let me admit him back to the program. He is joining right now just so he can say goodbyes. And um, it says he's joining. So I'm going to just be patient over here and keep giving you all some more information. So next time I stream is likely going to be Thursday night with Scott Ritter. Okay, Thursday, October, what is that? The 10th? The 9th? I don't even know. Thursday. Scott Ritter will be coming. Looks like Professor Marandi is still joining here. Don't see him just yet. Um, and what else? What else? What else is there in terms of housekeeping? Oh, I cannot. I do not really. There was something about what's going on. Here he is. There he is. Okay, Professor Marandi is back. Let me share the screen. Make sure that there he is. Hey, Professor Marandi. Good to see you again.
Hi. I think we should. I only have 1%, and
Yeah, yeah, of course. I think there's some technical problems. So I don't know if you had any closing points or closing thoughts you wanted to make about Hezbollah, but if not, anything you want to say to close, and then we can depart here.
I just wanted to say that I have no doubt that Hezbollah will come out on top. They will, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, they'll hold their own, and the Israeli regime will fail, and it will be tough days and weeks, if not months ahead. But they will emerge victorious, and ultimately the objective is to have a land where Palestine, where Jews, Christians, and Muslims are uh, of the same status, and where they can live side by side as equal human beings, something that seems outrageous in the West, but that is the only real solution to what's happening. I am optimistic about better days ahead, but it's going to be tough, and no one should be discouraged. We should all keep active. And I'd like to thank you again for inviting me.
Of course, Professor Miranda. Yes, and we will, as things develop, I'm sure we will be back in touch. With all that said, everyone, again, best thing to do. First of all, go to the video description and follow Professor Marandi on X, because that's where you can find all of his interviews. He shares everything that he does there. Be sure, though, to go to the video description, because that's where you can find Rumble. That's where you can find Telegram. That's where you can find Substack. That's where you can find Patreon, especially those last two. If you subscribe there to support on a paid basis, then whatever happens to this channel, that will allow me, if this platform decides that this is the end, then I can continue to make a modest livelihood while I continue to do this work. So it's really important, because this is the move. The move is to silence us. And we've seen over the last several weeks, so many have their platforms taken down. So again, go to the video description after you're done here with this program. Be sure to support any way you can. And with all that said, everyone, I'll be back on Thursday evening with Scott Ritter to do a full breakdown on Ukraine, as well as, of course, what's happening here in West Asia, as we discussed today. And with all that said, everyone, goodbye, and I will see you again very soon.